Yoseph Haddad.
Well, thank you very much for this warm introduction, and again, thanks for having me here. It is an absolute pleasure and important as well. Just before I start my speech, I do want to address a few things of what Olga mentioned, because it is important. I visited South Africa myself, and you know, during apartheid week in Johannesburg, and one of the fascinating things that I found when I spoke to students in Johannesburg is, after I told them the story about the Arabs in Israel, also as well in the West Bank and in Gaza, I then said the sentence, making the, referring to the real apartheid that happened in South Africa and compare it to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is actually doing injustice to the South African who suffered from a real apartheid regime. And this is something that I found also fascinating, to see the comments and the responses from South African while I was speaking there, nodding their head with acceptance after they heard the reality of the Arabs, whether it's in Israel or in the West Bank or in Gaza. So I had to say something about that. You know, as an Israeli, I am not surprised to be discussing in another UN report which obsessively bashes my country here at the UN in Geneva. In fact, it's more of the same old, same old. But you know what? As an Arab, I'm absolutely fed up. I'm fed up because this obsession against Israel actually prevents resources and attention from being put up in the right places, both inside Israel, as we work to bridge gaps between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, and internationally. As an Arab Israelis, we have many problems to resolve within our society. For example, Arab Israelis are vastly underrepresented in government employee positions. What should be closer to 20% of employees is more like 1.5%. Our schools are not up to the standards they should be. And we have a massive problem with illegal weapons. But instead of finding productive solution to meet these challenges, bodies like the UN have no idea what's actually going on in Israel, are lecturing us, Arab Israelis, about how our life is as minorities in our own country. Even worse, they presented it as if we Arab Israelis are not in fact Israelis with equal rights under the law, the same as any Jewish Israeli. For example, they cited the nation-state bill in the report, a bill I actually oppose because it doesn't go far enough to emphasize Israel's democracy nature. But they misrepresented the very essence of the bill, claiming it impacts the civil status access to social and economic benefit or the right to land and property for Arab Israelis. This is a flat-out lie. Let me clarify for the Commission of Inquiry that I am an Arab Israeli with equal rights under the law in the State of Israel. We do not need the UN or the EU or any other body to come to tell us how to run our country, and such reports only inflame tensions in the region and embolden extremists who damage the unity between Arabs and Jews in Israel. This report, at its core, fundamentally misunderstood the conflict and misattributed every social ill, and I mean every social ill that impacts Palestinians, to Israel. The Commission of Inquiry, like others before, it was intended to address alleged crime wars in the last Gaza operation in May 2021. But reading out through these 18 pages of drivel, it isn't thorough investigation, but the facts on both sides, but rather a poorly researched report filled with sloppy, false information, almost none of which even addresses the Gaza operation. The UN Human Rights Council extended their mandate to address all underlying root causes the recurrent tensions. All. Nowhere in this report did they address the underlying root causes of Palestinians refusing to recognize my country's right to exist, or the fact that Palestinians have rejected multiple offers for peace, or the issues of incitement within Palestinian culture, or the Palestinian leadership's corruption. No, they just blamed Israel. I guess we can't really be surprised when the head of the commission, Navi Pillay, is a known anti-Israeli activist who smeared my country as apartheid and supported boycotting it. Does that sound like an impartial investigator? Yes, this is it. This is what the UN Human Rights Council is spending their resources on. While China puts Muslims in concentration camps, Afghanistan is run by the Taliban, which is a cracking down on women's rights. Iran is the largest sponsor of global terrorism, and Russian troops commit war crimes and sexual assault, including against children. The UN Human Rights Council is paying for this commission of inquiry to spread lies about Israel and minimize responsibility on the Palestinian side. Now, let's review a few of those lies in this report. First, they simply don't know the facts. They claim that Israel occupies Gaza as a result of the blockade, including land crossings and borders, as well as civilian infrastructure, including water and electricity. This is a lie. The blockade is an Egyptian-Israeli blockade, and even this report contradicts itself by stating in another section that they appealed to Egypt for permission to enter Gaza via the Rafah crossing and received no response. They also falsely claimed that Israel's blockade hindered water and sanitation in Gaza, damaging the health system. As per Oslo, the Palestinian Authority assumed full responsibility for their own health care. They also claimed that the entire territory discussed in the Oslo Accord, Area A, B, C, as well as Gaza, was to be handed over the Palestinian. This is blatantly false. The territory was to be decided only in the final status negotiations. And then you wonder, has even the UN read the Oslo Accords? Here's something the UN should learn. Water and electricity is paid for and provided by the Palestinian Authority, not Israel. It is a bitter internal political fight between Fatah and Hamas that prevents adequate resources from being invested in building better water sanitation, generators, and water aquifers, not Israel. But that didn't stop this report from blaming Israel for destroying Palestinian water infrastructure and then lying about the cause of the problem. Experts in Israeli civil administration confirm that Palestinians constantly avoid meetings with their Israeli counterparts to address the problems of water shortages in the Palestinian territories. After all, and listen to this, the UN is literally providing incentives for Palestinian leaders to behave this way. It gets them more aid money when their people suffers. We know for certain that the water pipelines aren't separated between Jews and Arabs. They are shared. Shortages in the water are widespread because Palestinian police do not prevent the illegal siphoning off of water to Palestinians who dig into the pipelines. Nobody talks about that, by the way. Many of which span the entire West Bank, such as the pipeline which runs through Hebron. In another lie, the report claims Israel allows the establishment of Jewish settlements outposts. In fact, Israel destroys illegal construction regardless of who builds it. And recent years have shown that more illegal Jewish constructions were removed than Palestinians. They criticized Israel for correctly labeling 6 NGOs as terror fronts for the PFLP, claiming it is a threat to civil society. Really? Because there are 45,000 NGOs in Israel, and none of them seems to have this problem, including NGOs like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, which work against the state. Additionally, there are hundreds of anti-Israeli international and Palestinian NGOs operating in West Bank and Gaza. But you mean to tell me that Israel labeled only 6 of them just for fun? It is not even logical. The report falsely claimed that the purpose of Sheikh Jarrah house evictions were for the benefit of settlers, Again, misrepresenting the reality of a complex lawsuit which had been going on for decades, in which the tenant refused to pay rent to the legal owners of the property. It also claimed that the May violence broke out partially as a result of the use of force by Israel against Palestinians during Ramadan, which is an outright lie. Every year, Israel grants thousands of additional permits for Muslims to worship freely at Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, unlike Jews, by the way. The riots in May 2021 occurred due to Palestinian instigating violence, not Israel. The report stated that Israel has a three-tiered system of laws for Jews, Palestinian citizens of Israel, apparently it's up to them to identify my identity, and Palestinians in East Jerusalem. This also claimed that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are eligible for Israeli citizenship. Another lie. They're all eligible to apply for Israeli citizenship, and many of them actually have. Aside from the outright lies, this report places sole responsibility of Israel, but gives Hamas and Palestinian leadership a free pass. For example, they mentioned Israel 157 times. But the terrorist organization, Hamas, only 3 times. They claim that there is an issue of accountability with Israel, and such as Israel is responsible for the failure of Palestinians to stop domestic violence. Yes, seriously, that's what it says. They stated that the occupations is the core of cause of unemployment in Gaza, with no mention of the rampant corruptions, of misuse of fundings, and terrorism by Hamas. They even complained that the Palestinians haven't held election in over a decade and blamed Israel for it. Yeah, we are the one to blame for not having elections. They intentionally misrepresented the facts by condemning Israel for targeting residential buildings in Gaza while ignoring IDF efforts to evacuate the buildings ahead of time, and the role of Hamas in using residential buildings for terrorist activities. It's not even me saying that. Even Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar said it himself in an interview. They slam Israel for what they call discrimination in granting building permits and its impact on the Israeli Bedouin communities. But no mention of the multiple times Hamas has confiscated lands from Palestinians in Gaza and even used live fire against Palestinian protesters. And by the way, this literally happened this week. The report rests on false premise that until occupation ends, this issue will not be resolved for Palestinians. It reminds me of a famous statement by former US Secretary of State John Kerry, in which he insisted that there will be no peace in the region until the Palestinians have peace with Israel. Well, guess what? As we saw with the Abraham Accords, this is the furthest from the reality and the truth. But supporting or opposing occupation isn't even the question here. The question is, will ending occupation, as the UN claims, really end the conflict and the problems for Palestinians? As an Arab, I am here to tell you unequivocally, no. Ending the occupation will not end the conflict, nor will it resolve the social problems within Palestinian society. Where the UN should be stressing pressure on the Palestinian Authority and the terrorist organization Hamas to stop violence, they are blaming Israel for defending itself. Where the UN should be holding NGOs which fund terrorism accountable, they are condemning Israel for exposing the truth about them. Where the UN should be demanding the Palestinians recognize the right of Israel to exist, the problem which led to present-day situation in the West Bank after the Six-Day War, the UN instead panders to corrupt Palestinian leaders who have led and are leading their own people towards violence and destruction. My message to the UN itself in this is if you want to see a genuine peace with the Israelis and Palestinians, stop fueling lies and incitement with reports like this that enable the fundings and those exploitation of the Palestinian people by their own leaders. Your interference is hurting far more than helping. You are part of the problem. This peace will be made by Arabs and Jews on the ground, not by your report produced to justify your outrageous, inflated budgets and lack of result to show for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoseph, for your very powerful testimony.